Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat Worlds Crusade, where Warmaster Slado has suffered his first serious reversal, both on the battlefield and in the arena of Imperial politics. After the Imperial Navy failed to secure passage through the northern Chaos Triangle between Gothrone, Helena, and Hisk, the swift decapitating move favoured by Slado in Operation Newfound proved impractical. And whilst Operation Newfound would continue, its lofty hopes of a swift defeat of the Chaos front lines proved to fall foul of that most frequent of truisms, that no plan survives contact with the enemy, external or internal. As this was just the kind of opportunity that many of Slado's detractors had been touching themselves whilst dreaming of at night. And foremost amongst these malcontents was a man named Hector Drax, a living exemplar of the fact that a Lord Militant's baton does not always end up in the correct pair of hands. But whilst the Lord Militant's competency would be questioned by many over the coming years, it cannot be denied that the preceding 20-odd years had been very kind to Hector Drax, as he had won many significant victories, including crushing a major Chaos uprising and being one of the first Imperial Guard commanders to encounter the then novel and rising threat of the Hive fleet, and living to tell the tale. Now, those of a less than charitable disposition might hasten to point out that many of these successes were earned not off the back of Hector Drax's military acumen, but rather off the backs of his Jantine patricians, his favoured regiment of elite heavy assault troopers. But just as amateurs blame their tools for their own failings, so too do jealous commanders ascribe the successes of their competitors to the troops under their command. A slightly more charitable interpretation of the Lord Militant's career reveals an unimaginative man, to be sure, but one who also understood the Imperial Guard for what it most commonly is: a blunt instrument, to be wielded with determination and conviction more often than it was to be wielded as a scalpel. And indeed, this was the very lesson that Warmaster Slado had failed to heed, as his over-optimistic Operation Newfound, the slashing move towards Balhut and behind the Chaos lines, had failed. And many would argue precisely because he had tried to use a bludgeon as a knife, and thus failed to concentrate sufficient forces to create his desired breakthrough. This was again exactly the kind of circumstance that the Warmaster's competitors were looking for. Hector Drax had fully expected to be named Warmaster himself after his recent successes, and he was none too fond of Slado, whom he viewed as a unjust usurper. The feeling was very much so mutual, as Slado too bore a deep and personal resentment for Hector Drax. In fact, Hector's favoured strategy for the invasion of the Sabbat Worlds was the so-called main-line assault, where instead of a series of fanciful steps designed to attempt to throw the enemy off balance, he had argued simply to drive straight to Balhut, running a wedge through the heart of Chaos resistance, and then mopping up the scattered, demoralized remnants. Thus, the plan was much like the man who had presented it: blunt and unimaginative, but also probably effective. as it is difficult to imagine just how precisely the Chaos Forces could possibly have parried a thrust made by the entire strength of the Imperial Crusade, driving directly towards their provincial capital world. And due to that promise, the mainland assault had remained an option for the invasion of the Sabbat Worlds up until literally weeks preceding departure, at which point Warmaster Slado had unilaterally laid down a veto against the plan, and instead presented his own vision as the final blueprint for the invasion. Hector Drax undoubtedly took that exactly as it was intended, as a deliberate slight. But in an effort to not upset his command cadre too much, Warmaster Slado did also assign Hector Drax to be part of the attack on Long Hayland, which was expected to be one of the easiest targets of the opening months of the Crusade. But if the Warmaster expected this overture to somehow settle the Lord Militant's ruffled feathers, then he was to quickly be proven very, very incorrect, as Hector Drax took the credit for the success at Long Hayland and turned it into a platform from which to attack the Warmaster. And now that he had been blocked by the Chaos Triangle, the central assault plan was once again resurrected. With troops taken primarily from the faltering northern front and refocused towards the world Ambold 11, which just so happened to be the original target for the Centerline assault as well. And almost immediately, one can begin to see the hand of the Anarch in action yet again, as when the Imperial Navy began its attack upon Ambold 11, Admiral Carsley noted an unusually heavy concentration of enemy forces in orbit. Not only was the planet protected by local space defense forces, but it also possessed several orbital fortresses. Now, these spaceborne fortifications proved little challenge to Admiral Carsley's forces, because in and of themselves, an orbital fortress in the 41st millennium is not a very effective defensive work. Being as it is stationary, an assaulting fleet has every advantage. It can attack it from any direction. It can dart into its own maximum firing range, let loose its weaponry, and then simply leave again. It can do this however many times it wants to, not only complicating any potential firing solutions from the fortress, but also allowing the warship, of course, to disengage if damaged. Whereas all the fortress can do is sit there and take it. Now, of course, the fact that the fortress does not need real space or warp engines does mean that it has plenty more space for weapons and armor, and such space fortifications are certainly hardy nuts to crack, but unsupported, they are in essence helpless against any decently led navy contingent. If, however, the Imperium had immediately launched its main strength and weight against Ambold 11 in the Centerline assault, and the Anarch had seen it coming, then these fortifications would have been enormous, heavily armored massed batteries of weaponry, supported by fleet formation of Hedwag ships. And even had the Anarch not seen it coming, and bear you in mind here that the Anarch had so far been outwitting Warmaster Slado, so it seems difficult to imagine that he would somehow have struggled with outfoxing Hector Drax. Well, the Hedwag fleet formations had up until now in the campaign demonstrated again and again an ability to relocate rapidly whenever needed. So in all due likelihood, had the Centerline advance been chosen as the invasion plan of the Sabbat Worlds, it would have resulted in a titanic fleet clash. With the full force of the Imperial Crusade's naval elements pitched against, no doubt, the majority of the Anarch's naval forces. Now, it is difficult to guess with any degree of certainty which force would have come out victorious in such a behemoth confrontation, but the very fact that the Anarch had apparently prepared for it suggests that he was confident in winning such a decisive battle. That fact alone should be more than reason enough for the Imperial commanders to attempt to avoid it. And considering that the Vahedvak formations, again, previously considered to be nothing more than piratical raiders, had put up staunch resistance against the Imperial Navy's efforts in the Chaos Triangle, well, suffice to say, it was probably a good thing that it was Slado, and not Hector Drax, that was granted the title of Warmaster. Anywho, as it was, Admiral Karsley's naval forces easily defeated the spaceborne defenses of Ambold 11, including its now unsupported fortresses. This opened the door for the subsequent land invasion under the command of General Dylan Belfry. Now there's a name to inspire confidence in the average Imperial Asman, isn't it? General Dylan, elected, for a very high-risk, high-reward strategy. Which is curious, because there was no real pressing need to do so. If indeed Operation Newfound, which had just so barely started, had actually succeeded in its objective, then Ambold 11, along with scores of other worlds, would be cut off and easy pickings further down the line. It would therefore seem peculiar to go all out on an early victory on a world like Ambold 11. Unless, of course, Hector Drax had whispered a few choice words into General Dylan's ear, stating that if Ambold 11 could be won quickly, then not only would it somewhat undermine Operation Newfound, but it would also demonstrate to all the other commanders that the Centerline assault had merit. This is of course nothing more than pure speculation, but the targets selected by General Dylan for the initial landing operations were amongst the most heavily defended on the entire planet. Pelbury Civitas, Upper Gamph, and Amboldus Hive, where Imperial Guard forces would be dumped down almost directly on top of these enemy-held positions, including, as the name suggests, a full hive city. General Dylan was either supremely confident in his men vis-a-vis the Chaos Defenders, or in a real bad hurry. Unfortunately, we cannot ask General Dylan what he was thinking, and I assure you the Inquisition would have loved to do so, as the general was killed in a mortar attack, as he was leading his forces in an assault on the city of Pelbury Civitas. The Imperial Guard's initial orbital landings had no doubt hoped to seize all three primary objectives outright, using shock, awe, and surprise. But the triple wave orbit-to-ground assault had failed at each and every one of the objectives, leading instead to month-long sieges. It was during one of these assaults upon the outer walls of Pelbury Civitas that General Dylan was killed. Now, the quality of the Chaos Defenders were nothing particularly noteworthy. No Heritor Asphodel or Wall of Woe machines here, nor were there any particularly charismatic charismite to lead the defenders either, nor were the defenders themselves much to write home about, mostly a random mix of chaos militants and heretic scum. At absolute best, they were eager amateurs, and they should have been easy pickings for the disciplined ranks of the Imperial Guard. And in an open engagement, no doubt they would have. And this may indeed be a somewhat more charitable explanation for General Dillon's apparently exaggerated confidence. But at the same time, any general of the Imperial Guard worth his gold braid should have recognized that even eager amateurs can be a significant impediment when they are hiding behind solid, concentric lines of armed and armored city walls. It was in an escalade on the outer walls of Pelbury Civitas that General Dillon was killed, during an action that cost close to 10,000 Imperial Guardsmen their lives merely to secure a breach through the outer walls of the Civitas. Now you may well, as, again, I assure you the Inquisition was, be asking yourself, what exactly is an Imperial General doing leading a ground assault on a fortified enemy position, in which close to 10,000 troops were slaughtered? That's a very good question. Again, we would love to have asked General Dillon this question, as the only conceivable explanation I can see is that, again, he was in far too much of a hurry to secure victory at Ambold 11, despite, yet again, the planet's relative strategic unimportance. Now, there are times in which Imperial leadership can and should take to the field of battle personally to inspire their men, but this is always done at a tremendous risk. A tremendous risk amply demonstrated during this action, as after the death of General Dillon, Colonel Beguilin, his second in command and the leader of the Sarpoy Regiment leading the assault, attempted to reassert command and control authority, and lead the assault further in through the breach and against the enemy's innermost defenses, where he swiftly found himself trapped, as the Chaos Forces allowed the majority of the Colonel's remaining troops to filter in from outside of the Civitas walls, before launching a massed countercharge against the breach, retaking it from the Imperials and leaving them stranded in between two sets of defensive walls. By all rights, the Colonel, his command, and every guardsman under him should have been slaughtered in a rarely matched one-sided engagement, with the Chaos Defenders taking their time picking off the wounded, distraught, and trapped Imperial Guardsmen, running out of ammunition, running out of water, running out of rations, running out of hope. But every now and then, even in the darkness of our far-flung future, a miracle does happen, as the forces of the Iron Snake chapter of the Adeptus Astartes rerouted themselves. They were originally on course to the planet of Sverren, but they decided on their own initiative to change course and launch an immediate rescue operation towards Ambold 11, where they carried out a drop pod assault right on top of Pelbury Civitas. This too was a somewhat desperate action, intended to save the beleaguered Imperial Guardsmen rather than guarantee the fall of the city. The worst case scenario could easily have been the Space Marines left just as trapped as the Imperial Guardsmen they came to reinforce. A maximization of failure. But fortunately for the Guard, the Sons of Ithaca were made of significantly sterner stuff than Colonel Beguilin and his Sarpoy regiment. as not only did the Iron Snake save the Imperial Guardsmen stuck in between the defensive walls, the Iron Snakes also moved on into the Pelbury Civitas itself, and over the course of the next hours and days claimed the lives of an estimated 29,000 heretic troops. A significant number of which were probably not, strictly speaking, fighting personnel. But in a city so long fallen to chaos, what truly is the difference between a warrior of the arch-enemy and a press-ganged civilian? It was, all in all, a remarkable military action that transformed a burgeoning disaster into a success. One with a touch of bitterness to it, to be sure, as it had cost the lives of tens of thousands of Imperial Guardsmen and 8 of the God Emperor's finest. But at least it had not led to the complete destruction of the forces then under Colonel Begillin's command. And, incidentally, Colonel Begillin survived the ordeal. And the Inquisition had questions for him too. Questions that would swiftly put right the injustice of his survival, and so many of his men had been sacrificed due to his incompetence. Thus, this was also to be the first battle in the Sabbat Worlds Crusade where the Imperial Guard's leadership took a serious hit, with the loss of a general and a colonel. One claimed by enemy action, the other claimed by inaction in the face of the enemy. It would take quite some time longer, but Ambold 11 would eventually fall to the forces of the Imperial Guard, as the Iron Snakes got back up into the void to hurry on to their actual target, the world of Fornax Aleph. And it would turn out to have been an Emperor-sent blessing that the Iron Snakes had been diverted to Ambold 11, as by the time they arrived in the skies above Fornax Aleph, there was nothing for them to fight. Orbital scans revealed no enemy presence. For that matter, orbital scans revealed no Imperial presence, despite the fact that the Iron Snakes had now been delayed for 3 months. The Imperial Guard forces that they were supposed to be assisting in the assault on Fornax Alpha had long since arrived. Indeed, they were now gaining access to, after finally arriving out of several severe warp storms, to lengthy logs dispatched by the Imperial Guard commander who had landed on the planet. His name was General Jatta Elbeth, and he had been dispatched with significant Imperial Guard forces, including armored support regiments and the expected aid of 300 Space Marines. A substantial force to take a world so early on in the Crusade. But Fornax Aleph was expected to be a major enemy staging world, and probably a key concentration point for the Hedwak fleet forces, or at the very least, a continuous supply and organizational point for the enemy's naval assets. Thus, taking it out early on in the conflict would presumably save the Imperial Navy significant headache. But General Jatta's forces had been scattered by the same warp storms that had so severely delayed the Iron Snakes. Arriving in system with less than a third of his total complement, the general initially assumed that he would be forced to retreat from the system, and assumed defensive positions at the nearest stable warp translation point. As he expected to see the Hedwak ships rise up to meet him at any moment, and as he had been separated from the majority of his navy escort, he would then have had no choice but to flee back into the warp. It would have been a serious setback, and it might very well have placed the rest of his command in enormous danger, as they too might arrive in system at any moment, piecemeal and scattered, easy prey for the Chaos Defenders, and yet no enemy fleet arrived. Not a single ship, not a single vessel. Indeed, there weren't even any indications that the Imperial fleet elements had been detected at all. They were not being painted by long-range auspexes. They could detect no psychic presence, as if astropaths were operating on the planet. There seemed to be no communication or even energy signatures emitting from Fornax Aleph. This, considering the world was supposed to be a major fleet staging point, was absurd. And the general knew this. Whilst he remained primarily in a position ready to flee, he elected to dispatch the singular frigate, the Ziegler, towards Fornax Aleph. Worst case scenario, this was some sort of chaos trap, in which case the tiny frigate would almost certainly be obliterated before it even had a chance to turn and flee. But it was the swiftest ship that he had under his command at the time, and if any vessel was at least pseudo-likely to be able to pull its neck out of the trap in time, it would be it. And so, with no small amount of trepidation, I imagine, the tiny little frigate began burning in towards the planet, expecting no doubt to be blown from the void at any second. The anticipation only rising as it moved into range of what was presumed to be enemy defensive batteries, but no shots were fired against it. Nor could the Ziegler seemingly pick up any more readings either. No Chaos warships, no reactor activity, not even the lingering traces of the tremendous energy that a fleet at anchor would have created. Electing to push his luck far beyond that which most captains would have, the captain of the Ziegler elected to move his ship into high orbit of the planet. This would leave it a sitting duck if there were any anti-orbital defenses left on the planet. And yet, once more, no shots were fired against the Ziegler. And now in a position to turn off its primary drives and its shields and weapons, because again, if it was attacked now, it really would not matter, all power could be routed towards the auspexes. And they found nothing. There were no vessels. There were no signs of any major orbital constructs, at the very least, no active ones. There were no signs of military activity on the planet down below. The expected hive structures were just where they expected them to be, but no defenses, no chaos forces, no orbital batteries, no aerial traffic, no traffic full stop. The planet had, for lack of a better word, been abandoned completely. General Jeter then decided to move in the rest of his ships. No doubt there were plenty of alarm bells ringing in the back of his head, but here was a major enemy rallying point. Empty. Open for the taking. His mission remained the same, so despite any potential misgivings, he moved his forces into orbit and began deploying them. The hive cities were discovered and entered. There was no one there. They had not been sabotaged, however, and the engineers of the expedition easily restored power. There were no booby traps, no defenses, no chaos snare ready to snap shut around his neck. And that appeared to be all. He was still in regular communication with Warmaster Slado, and reports was dispatched back to Crusade Command on a continuous basis. Again, I expect there were many with some serious misgivings about this, but the ways of the enemy are inscrutable, and sometimes it is best not to look the gift horse in the mouth. The decision was made to establish control over the planet and await further Imperial reinforcements until all communication ceased. It was at roughly that point, shortly thereafter, that the Iron Snakes arrived. Obviously, they were instructed to immediately re-establish control with the Imperial Guard presence on the planet and General Jeter. But the very first communique to emerge from the Iron Snakes, authored by Brother Captain Cullis, simply said, "To Slader, Warmaster, my lord, there is no one here." By the way, this is why an Imperial Inquisitorial representative should always be available at any higher Imperial Command headquarters, because one of my compatriots, even the most inept and incompetent amongst them, would now have been more than able to instruct, advise, if you wish to be more diplomatic, the Imperial leader that it is time to fucking withdraw. As 20,000 armed men with vehicles ensconced in a hive city don't usually just disappear. Not unless there is something significantly scarier than 20,000 armed men bumbling around in the shadows. But because of Warmaster Slado's distrust of those who only wish to advise him well, 300 Iron Snakes were sat there wasting away looking for clues for 30 days. A force capable of conquering planets was sat twiddling their thumbs, playing at detectives for 30 days. And what did they find? Well, they found a tank. On the 80th floor of a hive city with a calcified human hand inside. They found something they think might have been a ship before it dived into the local star and burned up, but beyond this, they found diddly dick nothing. Why? Because the Iron Snakes, for all of their countless qualities, well, the investigations of the supernatural is not amongst their skill set. If it was, then they would realize that when things start disappearing and reappearing again in very weird locations, once more, this is a sign to start evacuating a planet. The Iron Snakes did not do so, and on the 30th day, just as Warmaster Slater finally, at long last, presumably on the urging of one of my kind, ordered them to evacuate the system entirely, a meteor appeared above the skies of the northern ice caps, slamming into the planet and causing a catastrophic chain reaction. Not only smashing the polar ice caps, flooding a substantial portion of the planet, but it also set off hundreds of volcanoes all over the planet, reducing the entire world into one enormous bleeding magma wound. Now, this and the then subsequent coverage of the entire world in clogging thick layers of suborbital ash would have been an unfortunate enough consequence for most living things, but not necessarily really something that would threaten the God Emperor Space Marines. No. The trillions of demons pouring forth from the planet's insides, they would take care of the threatening parts. Yet again, however, the Iron Snakes would prove a tough meal to devour. And by the time the rest of General Jeter's forces arrived, having now finally managed to arrive in system after their own lengthy warp-related delays, the Iron Snakes had all but completed the re-subjugation of the planet, defeating the countless demon hordes, although at a severe cost to their 3 deployed companies. As for what had happened to General Jeter himself and the first group of men, even this demonic insurrection could not really provide a full explanation. The demons obviously had something to do with it in all due likelihood, or if not the demons themselves, then the warp disturbances must have had something to do with it. But if the general and his men had been overrun by demons, then one would have expected to see the scorch marks of combat. As certainly the Iron Snakes left plenty of devastation in their wakes as they defended the hive against the demon hordes. To this day, no sufficient explanation has been presented. The Inquisition has its own theories, of course, most of which revolves around a deliberate chaos ploy, as it seems extremely unlikely, if not indeed downright naive, to believe that a planet susceptible to warp phenomena on this scale would not have been identified by the Chaos Forces. Led as they were by Hector Asphodel, or at the very least advised by him and his college, they would have studied the kind of phenomena that occurred on this planet. And seeing as there were no signs of a chaos occupation, nor any sign of the alleged naval yards that should have supported this forward deployment point of the headwork, it seems far more likely that the arch-enemy Archon had instead seeded false intelligence with the Imperium, perhaps even going so far as to create ghost fleets and dummy positions in orbit to convince the Imperium that this was one of the main staging points of arch-enemy resistance, in the hopes of luring a significant Imperial force to the planet, and then destroying it through occult means. As it turns out, their occultish means actually ended up saving the Imperial forces, as only a third of the total troops actually arrived in time to fall for the trap. Their arrival, too, clearly did not automatically set off whatever had been predestined to occur on this world, as General Jeter continued to send reports for quite some time. And as for the demons that bothered the Iron Snakes, if anything, I would imagine this to have been perhaps a contingency measure, or perhaps as a part of the sacrificial ritual. We know, for example, that chaos cults in the past have created rituals to drag entire planets into the warp. These requires enormous sacrifices of literal oceans of human blood, the kind of quantity that might be provided by a major Imperial invasion force, but also the kind of ritual that a relatively minor force of 19-odd thousand men might not have been able to provide. The Inquisition's theory, then, is that the Chaos Plan was thwarted to a certain degree, in, again, part due to their own warp storms. The number of sacrifices that arrived was simply not enough for the ritual to fully culminate. Thus, the demonic manifestations and the meteor that struck the planet later with the Iron Snakes upon it was probably not a deliberate machination, but rather the long-term fallout consequences of the initial ritual. A scar on the planet, and in reality, that simply had not healed by the time of their arrival. As for whether or not this makes the planet unsuitable for long-term population, well, that is a currently ongoing experiment, as orders have been issued for the garrisoning and the slow but sure repopulation of Fornax Alpha. To a limited degree to begin with, just in case something interesting does happen. But so far, the only remaining unnaturalness on the world is occasional visions, auditory and visual, encountered across the planet. Sudden screams or phantoms disappearing into the night. Such things are usually a sign of a softening or thinning of the veil, but they are not in and of themselves indicative of a breach, and it could simply be the long-term material trauma of the horrifying events that happened on the world. Now, as the population numbers slowly increase, we will soon find out if any remaining trigger of the original ritual remains, in which case some Imperial souls will make the ultimate sacrifice. If not, then the Imperium possesses a brand new planet. A price more than worth the sacrifice in souls, should it ever come to pass. But to return to the wider Crusade, the successful, if costly, assault on Ambold 11, and the also equally costly, but theoretically, technically successful assault on Fornax Alpha, had, at least to a degree sufficient to Imperial command, proven the viability of the Centerline assault. And so long as the Imperial Navy was occupied by the Northern Chaos Triangle, this was to be the most promising area of Operation Newfound's offensive, with subsequent assaults being prepared against Sveren and against Kokiaminus, which will both be the subject of our next video. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.